Well, Brexit itself is irrefutably an act of disengagement, and I feel the real danger lies in combination with the aftermath of the Iraq-Afghanistan interventions and the lack of political will to send so-called boots on the ground in future, if this could build towards a greater air of insular thinking and isolationism as a whole in the UK. And this simply isn't politically viable given the contemporary climate of geopolitical globalisation. The UK is not a self-sufficient island. We're dependent upon foreign actors in terms of our economy, trade, and in terms of security. If you look at the one end of the scale being the like of Putin's Russia and saber-rattling actions in Crimea and Ukraine and Syria, and the current migrant refugee crisis upon the EU, and then China's reportedly claiming what seems to be the entirety of the South China Sea, and at the other end of the scale, the likes of fragile and failed states of South Sudan and Libya, and in some instances these acting as havens for international terrorists. Now, I'd argue, is not the time to be turning our back on the world. If you look inwards in our policy and become insular in thinking, these other things outside of our own borders aren't just going to disappear. They're still going to influence the UK. Where it comes to UK's national security, foremost, when it comes to traditional security concerns, we're served by our armed forces, Home Office policing, the intelligence services, our nuclear deterrent, and foremost NATO. We are a leader in the EU, or we have been a leader in the EU, where it comes to the likes of the Common Security and Defence Policy, along with France, but our security, at least in the short term, won't necessarily overly be affected. However, in the long term, in terms of were we to become more insular in thinking and isolationist, and step away from frameworks that the EU works towards, such as United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, this could come back to haunt us through greater instability on a global stage. In simple terms, liberal interventionism is where a liberal state such as the UK or a coalition intervenes in what's seen as the sovereign affairs of a foreign state. This can be seen in terms of the responsibility to protect. The UK has a responsibility to ensure the likes of genocide and ethnic cleansing doesn't occur. However, really, the responsibility to protect has evolved to be a social contract between a state and its domestic citizens. Where it comes to intervening in foreign states, that's more an issue under the remit of the United Nations Security Council. However, in instances, it may still be required, as not all states enjoy sovereignty. Where it comes to fragile and failed states such as South Sudan and Libya, where potentially there may be international terrorists being harboured, there are instances where it's in that state's and our state's, and indeed the international community's interests, that there should be intervention. Where it comes to the past events such as in Iraq and Afghanistan, these obviously aren't success stories, and it shows the fallacy of these being military-led missions where it comes to implementing stabilisation. In UK institutional terms, a lot of these lessons identified have now been institutionalised in the likes of the post-conflict reconstruction unit, which later became the stabilisation unit. Our thinking has moved on. But when it comes to Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of people conflate the decision, especially in Afghanistan, the decision to intervene, and then the success of that mission that was to come. You shouldn't necessarily see the decision to intervene as being wrong because the mission went badly. Rather, the essence should be in institutional development to make sure next time the mission doesn't go wrong. And that's where it comes to the likes of the stabilisation unit and the lessons we have learned, which are very, very relevant for the future. The likes of the stabilisation unit, it allows us to use our influences of foreign policy in hard and soft senses through diplomacy of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the hard power of the Ministry of Defence, and the soft power of our international development aid assistance as per Department for International Development. and bring all these together in a more comprehensive or integrated fashion. It's important to note that security and development are very much interrelated, and for a long time it was popularly perceived that war, security and development aid were seen as separate domains. At the university level you'd have the likes of war studies being taught and the likes of developmental studies being taught, when in reality it's been popularly recognised since the 1990s that under and indeed uneven development can be a cause of political conflict through giving rise to grievances and greed, and a lack of opportunities in some instances, whereby in other instances there may be the opportunity to act out on grievances. This is why, when it comes to failed and fragile states overseas, if allowed to harbour terrorists or dissatisfied factions, political conflict can escalate and eventually come to the shores of the UK. Obviously the likes of the terrorist atrocity of 9/11 is the most overt instance of that, but the broad message is, I think that what popular understanding says now, is that underdevelopment gives rise to grievances, and instead of looking at wars and interstate conflict now, we're looking more popularly at intrastate grievances and conflict amidst societies. And this is why we need to bring together our hard power and our soft power to assist these states to be stable. I certainly think that Afghanistan and especially Iraq were seen as dismal failures and bad choices were taken. In that sense, it's easy to argue that there's a mandate to not intervene in foreign states in the future. However, you have to remember that we're not a direct democracy, we're a representative democracy, and when we elect our representatives, they have to make difficult decisions on our behalf. And if in the long-term interest of the UK and our security, it means we have to ensure stability overseas and assist fragile states so that we have in a broad sense, a stable international system that facilitates a free trade and all the rest of it, then intervention in instances still will be the right decision to make. Certainly I think the quality of the Brexit debate itself was embarrassing, and I think the UK as a result has been the butt of many jokes. And if we move towards greater isolationism, then certainly we'll have a lesser standing on the global stage. That may not necessarily be a bad thing in some people's eyes, but I would argue it is, in that it reduces the influence of the UK. We're not as powerful a state as we once were, and the layout of the international system has much evolved. This is why we need to continue to support the likes of the European Union working towards the likes of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and not actively undermine them. I don't think the stabilisation units will have a greater role to play. However, it is the fundamental institutional change which has evolved in our civil service where it comes to our foreign policy. And the way it can assist the Ministry of Defence, DFID and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is essential to the success of future operations and interventions. And so, as a new structure, it's one which we need to maintain and support into the future. It's very easy to say now Iraq and Afghanistan is over, that this isn't really, it doesn't have its own minister, it's not a powerful organisation, we can forget about it and take agency away from it. When in fact, as a whole, the way the UK can influence the world, it's essential that we do bring our departments together, and it's a stabilisation unit which is the conduit that guides the influence towards the greater mission of stabilisation. Put simply, my advice to the government would be to continue to resource the conflict pool and fund the stabilisation unit and what was the post-conflict reconstruction unit. In that, as a body, as I was saying before, it's institutionally imperative that the likes of the MOD, DFID and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and their influences can be brought together. The main problem that we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq was, as a military-led operation, civilian agencies were undermined. And as a result, although through the comprehensive approach it may be fair to say that all bases were covered, not everyone was working in the same direction. And it's essential that this idea of civil-military cooperation is eroded in favour of military support to stabilisation, and so that all different government departments and agencies are working towards a greater mission.